I was watching a Tehran professor talk to an American intellectual from universities and Central Intelligence Agency about what they call the war fever going on right now in the West. It was a recent video in early August of 2024. And it occurred to me that it might be helpful to describe the actual corporate mechanism that it's at work, which is foundational and very consistent and works as a sort of gyroscope in perpetual motion, surrounded by the sort of anarchy of mobs of racists in London throwing bricks, as we've seen in the last few days. Peter Gabriel fans in the East End of Pittsburgh lighting garbage cans on fire for the Steelers, turning over cars. Black people making Peeping Tom films for blackmail. And you get the feeling that the war fever is a mishmash of uncontrollable chaos. But at the root in the center is this conditioning system, which is gyroscopic and perpetual motion. And it works in Carnegie Mellon University. They have a drama department that in the 60s produced Godspell. They have a machine intelligence organization that works with Elon Musk, NASA, Israeli intelligence, Turkey, robotics, and the foundational intellectual of this area of, Herb Simon's domain, had a group that had a love-hate relationship with Herb Simon in the 60s, which was a sort of over-the-top pro-Vietnam War group that you would expect veterans to come up with as pretending they were anti-war so they could backstab the left. It's very typical of Carnegie Mellon University. Carnegie Mellon University is the one who came up with Y2K, a machine intelligence confusion scam that was used to create hysteria. Ronald, Mark, Y2K, the computer wanted to know which Ronald was which Ronald. And Mr. Rogers' neighborhood, of course, was drumming their fingers about keeping things neighborly. And in that crowd of love-hate relationship with Herbert Simon were the Relative Truth, a newspaper of a period of counterculture. But the Relative Truth is the root formula that's used for this mishmash. It's Ben's Holocaust Survivors Managers. It was a store for children. They sold grape balls and so forth. Would say, "What's yours? What's your grudge?" And it becomes a relative truth to pit against this again. And it was instituted with intent long before, back when the Burston letters were first being dreamed up, when the Texas school book was being dreamed up. Skibo was dedicated on November 22nd, 1961, I believe. There's a plaque there. And that's where Bush gave his voodoo economics speech. When they were dreaming up the voodoo of the relative truth, they were coming up with the idea of a disease claimant on no fault. I mean, it's nobody's fault, man. It's the fault. Lenin was a device for stigma. He was virtually a stigmata. that was used. And Louis Lapham's cousin is in the CIA. He was involved in it very deeply. He was one of the people who sold the plan, went for Reagan. You would think that a deafened, traumatized son of a human rights writer would bring him to their defense, but he was, oh, I'm too perverse for that. And he was hanging out with Borston, which Y2K machines couldn't tell from Borston. And partly because in the mind blenders, penis, Gabriel called it, they're the same thing. So everybody's relative truth is blended. And Cynthia Lennon said, nobody will escape Sean Lennon's vengeance. And the queer bait was a symbol of little boy from the Navy. The Navy said, well, let the Japs kill him then. And when I got out west, I discovered that they have a Tacoma Dome at the foot of a magic mountain, like the Hiroshima Dome, you might not know, had a legacy that they considered bombing the sacred mountain in Japan. And they give away these flashcards. So the Spinner Beanies came up with a cleansing operation of threatening America's with a purge of their guilt. This is Sean Lennon's ideas of what's right and wrong. That's why UW Dialectical flashed that enormous explosion in Lebanon back at the Crookshank of COVID-19. See, it's a perpetual motion gyroscope. What the agents of MI7 in King Crimson came up with was to call it the spinning mirror. In other words, it's so pointing at you, blame at you, that you never see that the person who's really to blame is the one pointing the finger, which was the Sergeant mirror, they called it, for Sergeant Pepper's. In other words, John Lennon's Houdini allowed them to do this. And it's just very ironic because they say there's an old adage, when treason prospers, none dare call it treason. That's essentially the same idea. It's the idea that, if they get away with pointing the finger, you can't possibly point it back. Which brings me to the question of this matrix system that Elon Musk and Herbert Simon, Noam Chomsky came up with. Noam Chomsky believed that you can just tell people what's going on and they'll just sit there dumb. That's what the Jews said happened in the horrors of Nazi Germany. They came here and told everybody, and everybody just said, oh, that's nice. They're doing Gaza as a demonstration project. People will just twiddle their fingers and they'll roll out the bombs to people who sodomize anybody. Children, blow them up. They bomb tent cities with $2,000 bombs. And they have Biden in this drooling state, and he's boss. And nobody complains. Nobody reports it. In fact, a lot of people in the margins like me do report it and get nowhere. So it's a demonstration project. So it doesn't bother them. It falls under the Fifth Amendment, that freedom of speech, that you can see from the cinema semiotic system and the history of these perverts in entertainment, that Reagan actually killed JFK and bragged about it. That Lenin actually pulled a Houdini and bragged about it. They don't care that you can nail that down, that you can put proof before the judges. They don't care. So what? Who cares? Nobody cares. It's the way that they repeat that sort of thing. So the gyroscope does this, but the mayhem people do all the rest. They come and say, oh, I have a grudge fulfillment. And the police say, okay, well, we don't want you throwing bricks at us. So, go have your way with the children of Gaza and Jimmaquirabate and so on. And that's how it operates. And they still call it the relative truth. Adam Eisenstadt used to say, whose truth, my truth or your truth? And the reason why there's no truth in common between these people is because they're incapable of telling the truth, grossly. Because truth is the service of civilization. The truth is that we should live at peace. And it doesn't register. Their brains have been eaten out by some madness. And it's a legacy of enshrining the bizarre attitude that might ranks right everywhere. So you can't reason with it. Ayn Rand gets a bum rap, but she made some pretty interesting contributions to this um, torture that goes by psychological warfare and rhetoric and so on. She described a man in a room with a maniac who's leering and jeering at him with the purpose all of his own, and he goes into a pitch of intellectual fervor. But the more he reasons, the more clear his reasons become. The more obvious it also is that this deranged beast of prey is just drooling at him with a purpose all its own. And that is the true personality of Israel. And what they did was they set it up weirdly as a metaphor for abortion. In other words, the queer bait who could have saved John Lennon and who needs to be executed by nuclear retaliation or as a symbol of um, cleansing over the nuclear guilt, which is Sean Lennon's pizzazz. He led all of these people to die in his father's name so he could get this thing going with his spinner beanie cousins. The the idea that it's rooted in a semblance of rational behavior was conjured by Michael Johnson and Pope Gregory Carl, who said the persona is subjected to successive degradations of the X motive. So the queer bait becomes the forbidden planet where the creatures from the id, which are the aborted fetuses, which were paid for and sponsored by, of course, Carnegie Mellon University's extremely malevolent military fraternities. You had psychopathic, feudal rivalries with the University of Pittsburgh, who formed alliances in this matter with Putin, with Pitt football, with Tridelt. This campus is lewdly crazed with intellectual wonderment at what they can think of, what they come up with. They use cryogenics so profoundly that it created an amorphous substance at an extremely low temperature, and they have teleportation. They snap the key out of my finger like this. They work with NASA and Pentagon, Disney, and have a drama school. Ming-No Wen just calls up Oliver Stone, who calls up Keanu Reeves, who calls up Jim Carrey, and they say, let's impinge on the persona for this big special project between Godspell and Hare, which is Oswald the Lucky Rabbit. And it exists. I'll just put it that way. It's the foundational structure of Bush's idea of a sacred witch hunt, in which Jimmy Crary was to be the hapless deaf child, and they violate all sorts of rights. They violate the right to privacy. They violate the right to have charges against you in a court of law. They violate the right to confront your accuser, to remain silent. They uh, invert innocence into guilt and say, prove me wrong when the accusation is virginity proves rape. If that's not prior proven wrong, then anything you say can and will be used against you. It's prior proven wrong. It's an innate absurdity. And it gives rise to this guerrilla absurd theater that they can't get enough of. And they throw rocks at police, and they turn over cars and light them on fire, and they rape deaf girls, and now they're sodomizing abductees. And Biden just sits there drooling. He says, way to go, way to go. It's like hit her again, Grandpa. Remember that scene in Texas Chainsaw Massacre? I never should have seen it. I was dragged to it as a hostage child in trauma. Can you imagine that? A nerve agent? And they did it in cold blood for the wonderment of Cyril Wecht, Martin Andelman, Willie Wadmaker, Paul Runco, Herbert Simon, Dick Sayert, Moravian, Putin. It was just wonderment for them all. And then at the end of it, they give me this baby girl who says, I love you, you're so interesting, and King Crimson, Peter Gabriel, love you. Let's get married. And that's their final detonation. All this stuff for the sanctity of marriage, and the goal was to ruin it. Wow! We ruined his marriage, man. Wow! Give me 5. Vietnam, man, he's avenged, man.